I don't have the button to tape it. Okay.
All right.
Already recording.
All right, we are here. We are recording. I also am here too because we know that there's a lot of misinformation going around LGBTQ support in schools and what that means for all students. Basically, what we are finding though is when you work towards supporting LGBTQ students, it's amazing. All students start to feel supported. The campus in general gets safer. So let's just jump right in. We're gonna go through a lot of things. Feel free to stop me too. If you have any questions, I encourage you to throw them in the chat. You can DM me, but you can like, yo, I don't understand this. Please explain more. Cool, so I think, can you all see this? So this is really taking off of the same type of education that we do directly for our teachers. I think it's also great for parents to get to know this as well. And I want to start really with the basics here because there is a lot of misinformation just about that. And what we find is that there are a lot of teachers that want to do this work. There's a lot of parents that want to do this work, but sometimes it's really hard to when you haven't had any sort of training or education around this. Because we're always wondering like, oh, I want to do this work, but I don't want to offend anyone. I want to do this work, but I want to make sure that that I'm doing it correctly. And, you know, this is really the first step into that trauma-informed approach that we're talking about. So the first thing we want to talk about is how do we refer to the community in general? Because this is changing all of the time. A lot of folks might see LGBT, LGBTQ, LGBTQ+. I could literally be up here today and say we're going to talk about the LGBTQIA, 2SP. By 2023, we're going to have the whole damn alphabet. That's our gay agenda. I'm just kidding. The agendas or the alphabet's already gay. But there is so many different identities under this umbrella that no acronym or shorthand or initialism is going to encompass every single identity. And I get this question a lot too. I actually was talking to some parents the other day and someone asked me like, Joel, I just don't understand. When I was younger, there was just gay, straight, and lesbian, and you had to be one of those things. And let me tell you that all of the identities that we're going to talk about tonight, they've all existed forever. The language around them may have changed, but they've all existed forever. And I promise you that there is not like some high gay council somewhere that's like just rubbing their hands together thinking of ways to piss off straight people and different language that will happen. I promise you that's not happening. If it was a job, I would apply for it, but I haven't found that yet. So all of these identities that we're talking about are definitely for the individual. They're not, you know, they're not something that a student will use just to say, oh, I think it's cool or whatnot. Because honestly, you know, when someone discloses that they're LGBTQ, we find that there is a higher risk there are much higher risk factors for them, including bullying, depression, and a lot of these things. This isn't just a fad or a trend that people use. I also just want to clear up, I was going to say queer up. I want to do that too. But I want to clear up what the word queer means. And I get this question a ton. People always ask me, Joel, I keep hearing people use the word queer, and I remember it as a slur or pejorative. And it absolutely still can be. It depends on the context. But we also have seen in the last 35 years, people really start to reclaim this term. Not just on the ground either, but even academically. When we look at different colleges across the country, they are starting to develop queer studies programs. So this is something that can actually be used. And when we talk about what does actually means, it actually means a lot of different things. And that's the beauty of the word. I use the word queer to define myself a lot of the time. And I guess broadly speaking, queer means some non-hetero or non-cis identity. But what's beautiful is that particularly young people get to define what queer means to them. So my queer identity really refers to not just the fact that I'm a gay man, but also the fact that that queer kind of represents my community that I belong to, the culture I primarily identify with in a lot of ways. The fact that I'm more effeminate too, something that like gay doesn't always encapsulate when I use. But I also do code switch a lot depending on where I am. Sometimes I'll say I'm gay, sometimes I say like when for Thanksgiving, although I primarily identify as queer, when I'm at home, I just say that I'm gay because I don't want to have to explain to Uncle Jeff what queer means. That's just a whole different. Everyone has an Uncle Jeff, right? All right, so let's move into really trying to understand some basics around LGBTQ identities. And the first thing we're going to do is really decipher what the difference between sex and gender is. That's our first two key characteristics around identity. Then we're going to talk a little bit about expression and then sexual orientation. So when we look at what sex means, we're really talking about how an individual is assigned at birth. It is based off of a person's anatomy, right? And when we say that sex, we're really talking about, you know, particular organs that a particular sex might have, or honestly, this is often assigned based off of someone's genitalia, right? So when we're born, the doctor, the midwife, the doula, the parent, whoever's there, they say, oh, this is a boy because there's a penis there, or this is a girl because I see a vulva. And honestly, this happens before birth a lot of the time. How many people have been to a gender reveal party? Hopefully you haven't been to one that started a fire in California. This is, you know, when we think about what gender reveal party is, we're really celebrating that we know the sex or the genitalia of an unborn child in a lot of respects. And interestingly enough, we're not actually celebrating that, we're not actually understanding someone's gender yet, even though we call it a gender reveal party. What you're revealing at these parties is sex, but no one calls this their sex reveal party because then you get a whole different crowd. You're not inviting grandma to the sex reveal party. I don't know, maybe you are. You could be a progressive family. But when we're talking about the difference between sex and gender, really sex has to do with our anatomy, and the best indicator of sex is someone's chromosomes. Chromosomes we often understand as, you know, when we think back to our biology classes in high school, we understand that very commonly people are either born with either XX or XY chromosomes. And, you know, when we're first learning about this, we pretty much learn of this in a binary. There's two categories, you either have XX or XY. But it's also really important that we recognize that these are not the only combinations either. And when someone has either a variation in these chromosomes and or a variation in their outward sex characteristics, we call that intersex. You may know a different term for this, and I'm going to say it once because I think it's important that I tell you what the term is, and then also that you don't use it anymore. You might know this term hermaphrodite. That is an outdated, it's an antiquated term, I encourage you to erase that from your vocabulary and replace it with the term intersex. And what does that mean? Well, those who experience or who have intersex conditions, all it means is that they have variations in chromosomes or outward sex characteristics. This is important for us to understand at school because so often, and to be very clear, there is a record number of legislation that is being presented across the country that is anti-trans in nature. And the majority of these are affecting young people. And as these are written, a lot of them are written in a way that says we are to rely solely on someone's sex as opposed to gender, to indicate where they go, what facilities they use, what activities they can have. But even when, and it's based off of this assumption that there's only two sexes too. And when we look at this, we know that there is an abundance of sexes. We have people with Klinefelter syndrome. We have people who have Turner syndrome, more than just XX and XY. So even when we think about, you know, what it means to segregate people by gender or sex, this becomes much more complicated even when we just use sex as an indicator. But it's also important to know that that sex is not indicative of how someone internally identifies. Before I go on, I want to just say intersex students are actually probably more common than you might know. Intersex births happen at about a rate of 1.7% of births in the US. And that's equivalent to people being born with red hair or people being born with green eyes. So have you met someone with red hair before? Yeah. Have you met someone with green eyes? Yeah. Then you probably also met someone who is intersex. But you probably don't know that because unlike red hair or green eyes, it's not something that you can see. How many people like to be asked about their genitalia or their chromosomes, right? That's not something we do. This is all very private. What we might be more attuned to is how someone what someone's internal sense of who they are is, whether that be a man, a woman, or something else. One of the things that we've learned is one of the best practices that we can do for our young people is really for all young people, not just for LGBTQ youth, is really understand that any youth coming into our school is an expert on at least one thing, themselves. We know that they are the expert of who they are. They understand who they are internally. And if they present to us their truth about who they are, then because they are the expert, then it needs to be our truth about who they are as well. Yeah. So once we, and this is so important because once we deny someone their truth or their expertise, especially for young people, then we have built a wall between them and we really trust you at all. When we do accept that young people are the experts on themselves and they know their own truth, and that is our truth too about them, then we have much more opportunity to interact and develop positive relationships with them. And just like with sex, we know that sex doesn't land in two categories, into a binary. Same with gender. Now, I've just presented you here, if you look at this whole thing, you see, oh, darn, there is a ton of different gender identities. And that may confuse people. I'm not every single gender identity and define it. Because we can look those up with our good friend Googleina, right? If someone comes out to us as a term we don't maybe understand, we are responsible for doing that research about what that means. And we can be honest with our students about it. You know, I'm not really sure what that means. let me look it up, do my research, and but I'm open to having this conversation. It's much more important to be open to it and to listen to why this is important for a young person. I do want to just go over what we find is, or what we, in terms of legally speaking, what is recognized in our legal systems right now in terms of gender. There are 3 genders that are legally recognized here in California. We all know of male and female. Those 2 have traditionally been recognized, but here in California, we also have the recognition of non-binary identities too. And what is non-binary? Well, non-binary is a huge umbrella that encompasses really anyone who doesn't exclusively identify as male or female, as a man or a woman. A lot of non-binary folks might choose to put it on their legal documents, but we also have a lot of folks that choose not to put it on their legal documents because how it appears on like maybe a license, right, is as not an M or an F, but as an X. And when we think about what that might be really affirming to them to have that X on their legal certificates, but it also can be very dangerous for folks to put that on there, because that means that every store that they go to where someone has to check their ID, they are essentially outing themselves with that X there. So the route of changing your gender legally may not be for everyone. And especially when we talk about youth, it's not always available to them. Okay, any questions so far? Cool, let's move into talking about these 2 terms. And this is probably where I get a lot of the same, or a lot of questioning is around these 2 terms, transgender and cisgender. What does that mean, right? I presented you before with a lot of gender identities, but I want us to be really clear. When we talk about gender identities, transgender is not a gender identity. Transgender is an adjective to describe identity, but in and of itself is not an identity. So let's talk about this. What does that mean then? Let's say we have 2 people. We have these 2 terms, transgender and cisgender. Let's just say we have 2 people in front of you, and they were both assigned female at birth. They have a sex that is female, XX chromosomes. And we're disclosed that, we know that. Let's focus on this person on the left, because both these people say something different though. One of them asserts their gender as a man. The other one asserts their gender as a woman. Focus on the left right now. Assigned female at birth and says, I am a man. When we think about those 2 things, 2 things are not aligned. They are not the same. Assigned female, identify as a man. That is a great definition of what transgender is. It's an adjective that describes someone whose gender identity is different from their sex assigned at birth. That's all it is. And I want you to keep this really simple, because a lot of people conflate this to mean a lot of other things that it doesn't. Particularly, a lot of folks associate this with medical interventions. So I want to just be really clear. The term transgender does not indicate that someone wants, needs, or has had any sort of medical interventions or surgeries before. And I think a lot of folks conflate what that is too. So often, and the reason I say that is so often when someone discloses their transgender, the first question they get asked is, oh, so have you had the surgery? Or what's going on with your under your pants? Which in any other circumstance, we would know that that is disgusting to ask. And it is absolutely disgusting to continue to ask for trans folks. Now let's look at this person on the right. Assigned female at birth, their gender identity as a woman, those two things do quote unquote align. That is what cisgender is. Cisgender is a term for people whose gender identity is aligned with their sex assigned at birth. Again, an adjective to describe this. When I go into the high schools, I go into 7th grade classes a lot for health class too, and I talk about this. And very often, a young person will tell me, "Joel, isn't cisgender like?" Why do I have to use cisgender? Isn't that just like regular gender or normal gender? And I'll tell you, and then I'll ask them like, well, if you consider that to be regular or normal, what does that infer about transgender people? That they're irregular or abnormal. So to avoid the trap of saying one is more regular or normal than the other, we just use these two terms. We say one is like some people are trans, some people are cis. And it normalizes both of those experiences, both of those identities, as opposed to saying there's trans folks and then there's the others, or the regular folks. Cool. And then, of course, we understand that, especially in schools, but not exclusively, but in schools, our system is flooded with ciscentrism. The school system, our systems in general. What does that mean? It just means that our systems, our institutions, our societies are set up for cisgender people, and they actively, if not consciously, other trans people. Let me give you an example of how this might happen at school, right? Let's even just talk about the number one thing that everyone talks about is facilities. Let's talk about the restroom, right? I know that as a cisgender man, when I went to school, I never really had any difficulty understanding where I would go to the restroom, that I would be safe in the restroom. It's just there for me to use. Transgender students, we are finding, have to negotiate this with every have to use the restroom. Will they be called out for using a certain restroom? Oh, they might have access to the nurse's restroom, but will the nurse be there at that time? Will the nurse question why I'm using that restroom? I'll even say, as I take my the youth that I work with out on field trips, whether it be, it doesn't matter, a park, a museum, wherever, I know that as a cis man, I can go into there's going to be a restroom for me to use safely. But most of the time when the trans youth I work with are there, they will ask me, Joel, can you stand outside of the restrooms while we go, because we don't feel safe in either one. We're also finding from, and I just briefly read it, but we have seen some studies, and I can find the actual studies, that trans youth have a higher rate of having kidney issues in high school because they are abstaining from going to the restroom during the school day. These are 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds that are having these issues that are seemingly not even a risk for any other students that are cis. This is the reality for a lot of our youth, but it's also more than just like bathrooms. Ciscentrism extends into, healthcare, into education, into all of our systems, and in the way that we interact with folks too. And that's something that we're trying to curb. So really the idea here, as we talk about ciscentrism, is that we often see higher risk factors for trans youth. We see that there is higher rates of depression, anxiety, absenteeism in school. We see that there is on average lower grade point averages than their cisgender peers. And a lot of people will look at that saying, well, it must be because they're trans. They will attribute these risk factors saying, oh, they're trans, and that's the thing that needs to change. Oftentimes equating being trans to in and of itself as a mental health issue. And that is wrong. Being trans isn't a mental health issue. Being trans and having to navigate through a world that doesn't see you and is actively violent against you, that is what sparks the development of those risk factors. And that's the main difference. I want to just break real quick. Any questions so far? We talked a little bit about sex and gender, and that's just a lot. And I often feel that this is a place where some people might have some questions about those two things. Dang, it's either Monday and everyone needs to get to sleep, or I'm just amazing. It's one of those two. I don't know.
It's that one. You're amazing.
Thank you, Judy. I have a little fan club.
You're fabulous. And I have to say, as a parent, like, this isn't something I understood maybe 5 years ago. I had a lot of like really binary understandings. And so I really appreciate you just like helping us understand these things. And yeah, thank you. Proceed.
Yeah. And this is, one of the things that we also find is that as we explain this to young people, it's not just our trans youth that benefit from learning these things either. Because every student has their own gender identity, every student has their own sex. And we really find when I go into school, I can even see like folks being able to explore what that means to them. And how we even find, one of the activities I do with young people is for them to first and foremost get in small groups and define what being a man is and what being a woman is. And it's amazing that there are such wildly different understandings of that. And so we have a conversation around what does manhood mean, what does womanhood mean, and then that bridges into what is gender in general around, and then it really kind of loosens up some of the strongholds of our social norms that some of our youth are experiencing. All right, let's move on though. Woohoo! All right, let's talk about expression. Our kids are expressing themselves in very unique ways, and we love it. Expression really just indicates how someone dresses, or their facial, their hair, their makeup, their speech, their language or tone, all of these things. And whether we like it or not, in our society, we find that most of our types of expression is coded with a sense of masculinity or femininity, right? When we think about just basic clothing, right? We know that like dresses are very much coded as a feminine thing. But say I was wearing a dress today. I've already told you that I'm a man. Say I was wearing a dress today. Does that mean that I am now a woman because I wore a dress? No, it might just mean that I like a light breeze up my legs, right? It is important to recognize that expression does not indicate someone's gender or sex. We also see that this isn't cross-cultural too, and living in Southern California, that's something we have to reckon with because we have a very diverse understanding, a very diverse location that we're in, even in especially here in Long Beach. When we say expression doesn't equal gender or sex, we're really talking about like think about those gender norms around gosh, I just lost my train of thought. I'm going to move back. Hold on a second. Let me grab it. Okay, let's think about expression. Like, I want to tell you a little story about a young person I was working with who is a transgender man. A young transgender man was going to high school, but could not tell their parents that they were that he was transgender. And his parents believed him to be a young woman. And so because of that, the parents only bought this young man feminine clothes to wear to school. He couldn't tell his parents because, you know, they were very conservative, and there were some risk factors involved with that. So he had to go every day to school in feminine clothes. And one of the things that he came to our center then with some friends at one point, and he told us this. And so one of the things we did was we got him a pair of pants to wear. And we knew he couldn't take them home, but whenever he was at the center, he was able to put on those pants, and he felt a little better because he only had skirts to wear to school, skirts or dresses. And at one point we said, you know what, you can go to school in pants. No one will tell your parents that works at the school, and we'll put you in repair, and you can just keep them in your counselor's office. And we know your counselor, she's an ally. You can pick up the pants every morning. And he said, that's really great, and I appreciate that, but I have peers at my school that know my parents. And I can't risk them seeing me in pants because they'll tell my parents at church, and I risk being excommunicated and all of these things. So something as simple as maybe a pair of pants can mean a whole world to some youth who are unable to express that. We also just want to, and we also find other reasons, right? Some other kids we know go to school on the bus. A lot of the kids I know go to school on the bus. And many of the kids that I know who are maybe trans feminine, that are young women, they won't dress femininely on the local bus because it actually puts them, they say they are more likely to be harassed on these buses when they dress femininely. So for their safety, they will not do that. This is how a lot of our young trans folks are having to navigate different situations in public all the time. So of course, with every new interaction, they're having to negotiate whether it's going to be safe or not to tell them their identity or their pronouns and things. Of course, that is going to have a negative impact on their well-being. Let's talk a little bit about, and then we're going to get into coming out, and then any questions you all have. Let's talk a little bit about sexuality and what that means for our students. So very commonly, when we think about sexuality, we think of, you know, how, you know, like someone is gay, straight, lesbian, maybe bisexual, any of those. But it's also really important that we understand the nuance behind this as well. Sexual orientation is how we describe who we're attracted to. And for a lot of our young people who are experiencing or questioning their sexual orientation, they may be experiencing differences in their romantic or physical attractions. And it's good that we understand this, especially during this age when they're first starting to, when a lot of them are first starting to navigate their first relationships with people, navigate their first serious crushes on people, that there can be a difference between someone's romantic attraction and physical attraction. I'm working, you know, I've worked with a young person for a long time, and you know, he has always said that romantically he's only interested in dating women, and but when it comes to physically, he's physically attracted to people of any gender. And so when people ask him what is your sexual orientation, he likes to answer with the term heteroflexible. He likes to say I'm heteroflexible, which I think is the cutest darn thing. Some other people might say, might have that same experience and say they're bi. So there's a lot of different terms. It's really important, though, that we mirror back the language that the young person is using, or that the individual is using, not just the young person, anybody. Because so often, like this happens in a lot of the time at our center, we have someone that'll describe their identity, and then someone else will say, oh, and that means that, they'll say, I identify as bisexual because I'm attracted to people of any gender. And then someone else might say, actually, that's more like pansexual, right? And there's this big argument over how to describe it, when in fact, it's really up to the individual to decide what language they're using. So one of the things we encourage is just to mirror back the language they're using, because one, there might be cultural differences around that as well. And two, it's not your identity. So policing other people's identity is not really encouraged. We also have a difference between, and I just want to say this, that some people might experience different sexual behaviors than what they say. And this is really nuanced too. Why do I say this? Well, oftentimes, let's just say there's a young woman who used to have a boyfriend, and then she comes out as a lesbian. And a lot of folks will say, well, you know what? You had a boyfriend. I saw you kissing that boyfriend like 2 years ago. I don't really think you're a lesbian. Sexual behaviors do not indicate how someone identifies. They could be different. I'm going to give you another example for the parents here. For adults, you'll understand this a lot. Prison system. Most men in prison identify as straight. However, when we think about people's sexual behaviors in prison, we understand that men often engage with other men in prison. A lot of the time it's environmental or it's for safety reasons, but we don't label them as particular. We don't go like, oh, dude, you're gay because of that. Because whose identity is it? It's his. They get to define that. We also have this idea of heteronormativity that is very much like cisnormativity, in that it really is the thing that kind of affects how and why LGBTQ people have higher risks. Heteronormativity is the reason why folks have to come out, because it is assumed that everyone is straight until otherwise noted. I was at a training once and someone raised their hand, which I always think is a great sign, but this time the person that raised their hand asked me this question. She said, ugh, do they have to learn about us? And I said, I'm sorry, I don't know what you mean. And she said, well, I have to sit here and learn about gay people. Do gay people have to go through a training on straight people? And I said, yeah, they do. It's called life, because it's in every book, every magazine, every movie, every TV show. Trust me, my little gay presentation here is not affecting your straight, ubiquitous straight culture. And she walked out of that training. And then I'm a Gemini, so I told her boss. I don't know what happened to her afterward, but I don't know. She should have been there though. It was required. We're going to skip past these real quick, and I just want to jump right into this development piece. We often see that sexual orientation, a lot of people say that doesn't develop until you're in puberty, you don't know. But consider this, right? Consider this. We have little Billy here coming home to mom and says, Mom, I have a crush on Cindy at school. Billy says, I have a crush on Cindy. What does mom say? Oh my God, that's so cute. That's so adorable. Totally fine with this situation. It's a really adorable thing. Say we have little Bobby though. Little Bobby is here in the same kindergarten class and comes home and tells his mom, Mom, I have a crush on Brian at school. Are you going to get the same reaction often? Well, depending on the parent for sure, but oftentimes we find someone saying, oh, honey, you must be confused. You won't know that until later. Sexual orientation can be discovered at any age. I remember when I was 5 years old, I had some warm, fuzzy feelings about Brian Diaz in my class. I have looked him up since. He is not available. And, but I also know that, that I didn't really understand the concept of gay at that time because I had never met someone who was gay. So of course, back in the day, a lot of the time, like when you asked, you would ask kids and no one would say that they were gay when they were younger because they didn't know that concept yet. Now we are finding young people who have more, we are finding folks that understand themselves much younger. And it's totally okay. What we always want to do is try to normalize it, and something like, oh honey, you must be confused, can really be the spark of that shame that a lot of LGBTQ people feel. Even though you're not saying, and you might be saying a lot of this stuff because it's you want your child to be safe. Well, that's what we find a lot of parents saying. One of the things that we recommend is that, one, we treat this the same way as if it were quote unquote heteronormative. And there are ways to it's actually safer to talk to youth about this than it is to shame them, saying don't think about it right now. And then who knows what thoughts will go through their head around that. They may actually think that, oh, I'm wrong, or something is not right with me. And they could internalize that for a very long time. Gender identity is formed between 3 and 5 years old. We've seen study after study for everyone, not just for LGBTQ youth. Between 3 and 5 years old, most of us have this understanding of what our gender is. And of course, young people during that age, when their gender doesn't align with their sex at birth, sometimes they'll say it to folks, sometimes they won't, depending on the environment. But when we find that there is insistence, consistence, and persistence of someone saying their gender is different than their sex assigned at birth, that is often an indicator that this child might be a trans child. Often will not come out as like, oh, I'm transgender, right? That is a word they often won't know. But sometimes they'll say they'll start to assert that they are a certain gender, and that is something that we get calls from a lot. And we know that when a child is supported in their gender identity, in this gender journey from their school and their home, that they can grow up and have little to no differences in their psychological well-being and their academics and their emotional well-being to their cisgender peers when they are supported. When they are told, no, you can't be this gender, or when they're not supported, then we see huge differences in that well-being. So we've actually kind of figured it out. As long as we have that support from home and school, we can mitigate those risk factors largely. All right. Last thing I want to talk about is this idea of coming out. So this is something I go over with children. We have students, especially in middle school, looking for trusted adults. And a lot of parents take this happens a lot too. I'm just really thinking about this. I have a lot of parents call me and say, yeah, I think my child hasn't told me that they're queer. They've told like their teachers and stuff. What am I doing wrong? Don't take it personally. Sometimes it is easier to tell a third party or another trusted adult than it is to tell your parents about something. And it's really important that there are those trusted adults for your students. Now, if someone does come out to you, just take this, as you will. Never say things like, the number one thing I get when I come out is people say, I knew it, Joel. I knew, I heard you listening to the Gaga Star is Born soundtrack, or I saw the way you walked, or whatever. And you didn't know it until I told you. On the opposite end of that, people might say, oh, I never would have known. And they often say that as a compliment, like, ooh, you hide it so well. I never would have assumed. I don't know why I'm doing my Lady Holter Pearls voice. That's a stereotype. Uh, but that is either one of those we shouldn't be saying. We shouldn't also ask like, are you sure, which is common, or you shouldn't tell anyone. Instead, it's really important that we, for young people, reframe what coming out is, because coming out is a big deal. And oftentimes there's this narrative that is attached to it that someone, when they come out, is leaving a dark, dank closet of isolation, and then they're entering a beautiful, colorful world. That's a wonderful narrative. It's also very unlikely for a lot of young people. Oftentimes, outside that closet, sometimes that closet is safer. Sometimes that closet is nicer in there. It's not always dark. Sometimes the world outside is much darker. So as the trusted adults in our children's lives, instead of students coming out to us, reframe it for ourselves, and they are letting us in to their space. And it is their space, and that means they own this space. They get to just decipher the rules. When you are let into a space, what do you do when you're invited over to your friend's house? Thank you for telling me. Be so honored. And then you want to ask, okay, how can I support you in this space? What are your rules here? And definitely, when you're invited over to a friend's house, you can't invite anyone else in unless that person says you can. So ask those questions. Who else knows? And who else can I share this with? And everything is continually open so that the individual can change their mind at any moment. Remember, this is their information to share or not share. And it may, for parents, it may feel like this happens often, right? One parent gets to find out, and then they say, please don't tell the other parent. And you may feel like, oh, now there's lies that I have to tell my partner or my co-parent or this other caregiver, or they may say, don't tell grandma. And even though you have an idea of how someone might react, the individual is not ready. And as a trusted adult, you have to trust them. You can definitely talk to them about it and say, well, what scares you? Like, that's a red flag for me, right? When they say, don't tell this person. Okay, well, what scares you about it? Oh, I'm just not ready for grandma to know. That's totally fine. All right. Or it might be like, I've heard uncle say X, Y, and Z, and I don't want to have to endure that. Okay, great. Thank you for telling me. But it is their information to hold as well. Okay. So I know we are running out of time. I want to leave some time open for any questions that you might have, really about anything that's happening. I know in this last week, we've been bombarded with news, a lot of it about what's happening globally, but we also have had some really strong legislation be passed in some of our southern states. So I'm happy to answer any questions about national stuff going on, or even here in Long Beach. So we have a question here. As we become more and more tolerant, inclusive, and accepting, do you ever worry about overcorrecting? That is to say, do some kids now feel like there's something wrong with them if they aren't questioning their sexuality or orientation? Like they're being left out or missing something? Let me just read the whole thing. As some kids, I understand where you're coming from, Jennifer, for sure. I think it's in how we frame this. When we say like, yeah, being LGBTQ for a lot of people is like super cool. And I think it's super cool. And it's really important for me to have queer people in my life too. And so I'll find queer friends that I can talk about some of these experiences with. Does that leave some other folks out or not understanding? It might. I don't want to say it doesn't. But as we as adults try to present this information, I never encourage folks to say, we are going to talk about LGBTQ things. like gender identity and sexual orientation and things, because guess what? Everyone has all of these things. So if we present this as normalizing all of the identities, the more we do that, the more there will be less exclusion on either side, right? Because like I said, when we repeat that everyone has their own sexual orientation, everyone has their own gender identity, it's not just a lesson for queer kids, it's a lesson for everyone to explore that. And everyone is unique and interesting. Do I think that there are chances that people might be persuaded into a certain identity? No. No, I think that if they are, if something is appealing to them and they've heard it, it probably would have been appealing at any time that they heard it or understood it, or it probably was there before. I've actually never seen a young person that has really said like, oh yeah, I felt really pressured into being queer. But yeah, and if there is like a more specific example, I'm happy to, you can definitely contact me and we can talk about particular to that to that example, or maybe real life situation. Any other questions, comments?
I have a question.
Sure.
Hi, Joel. So,
Hi.
so talking about, there's been a lot of stuff in the news lately, and you touched on it too, about safety in the, for the bathroom usage for our kid to identify as trans. What is the best solution for kids in school for bathroom use and for dressing out for PE? Do we, you know what I'm saying? Like what are some ways that we can make everybody feel safe? What?
Mm-hmm. So the best policy is an overall policy, right? It's not like again, this isn't a trans policy. We want to make sure that students know that they have a right to feel comfortable in these facilities. And if they do not feel comfortable in a facility, they can definitely come to a trusted adult and tell them what's going on so that we can figure it out, or if they need an alternative arrangement to be made for them. There's definitely some talk about what's happening at Wilson with the proposed them building a gender neutral locker room. And really what this does, as we talk about this, I think, and I understand if people have to leave because it is 8, totally understand, but I'll be here. It really just becomes a conversation, which I know it is at Wilson, what does student privacy mean for everyone? And if you actually look at the layout of these places, there's actually, I go to Cal State Fullerton and present for one of my friends' classes often. And when I go to the student union, there is a big open space with the faucets and where you wash your hands and everything. And then behind that is and it's gender neutral. Everyone uses the same washing hand. And then are all these stalls with longer doors and things like that. That's really the conversation that Wilson is having right now, is well, why can't there be a shared faucet space or whatnot, or you get your stuff from the locker and then you go into it. Actually, those locker rooms have way more privacy. So I think the conversation is more steered in, we really are not talking about a gender neutral locker room, as opposed to providing safety for young people, and what does that look like? And a lot of this gets tagged on to LGBTQ students when it's not really even about that. It's about students in general. So I hope that answered your question. That I don't know if there's a perfect solution, because there's always going to be someone that doesn't feel safe. There's always been someone that doesn't feel safe in a particular situation. And we've always been able to manage, or what we hope to do is manage that safety for that student. Yeah, so it is 8 o'clock. But I can stay around and answer any questions you have, but I know that some people have to go as well. Oh, hi. Okay, so there's an LGBT support club. Where how can our school use our yeah, that's a hard one. That is a difficult one. The best people to talk about LGBT things or to promote these things are the students themselves. When we have queer student leaders on campus, when we promote that, then we actually find that there is more awareness on behalf of the students in general. But yes, it's also it's also hard because we are sometimes code switching and navigating for students where at school we have teachers that are using the asserted name and pronouns that they've set. They're using he and him and using their name Roberto, but at home they have to go by Michelle and she and her. So when the teachers call home, they're switching up the name and pronouns again. You know, I think this is a bigger question than I can answer right now, but definitely we even know that for those students who are unable to come out for whatever reason, at school, at home, just by that representation in the classroom, having those visual keys of a rainbow flag, a trans flag that are available in school, that can make a student feel so much safer. Just the existence of your LGBTQ club in school makes your school safer and a lot of the impact that these things have cannot be measured a lot of the time. You will never know the amount of students that have come through your doors that have felt so safe the whole time, but never told anyone they were queer. And that's because maybe there was that trusted adult that had that safe space poster, put that trans flag on the back of their desk or whatever. That is what honestly happens for a lot of students who aren't able to say this. So I think y'all are doing so great, but I definitely want to work with you all more with the club. I got to visit them a couple times last year, and they're just really great kids. So feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to have a bigger conversation with y'all about it too.
I know when I was hosting it last year, I went with every kid. It was, you know, it was just a few kids, so we could just kind of have conversations with each individual, like where they were with their comfort and kind of have a plan for each one. So I don't know if that's something that I know it's a bigger school. We had like 5 kids, so like so you have more that you're working with. But.
Awesome. Any other questions, comments? Yes, Ellen.
Hi, Joel. Just as we're talking about this issue with locker rooms, and as you all are talking about it, I was just really thinking in terms of that underlying value of safety that it's after, and how that whole notion of any policy that's going to be supporting LGBTQ students is invariably going to be supporting students who identify as cis or het. And it got me thinking in terms of what is the opposite of that value? What is the kind of the fear related to? And I just wanted to bring this word into the conversation. I think what we're talking about a lot is sexual aggression.
Yeah.
And, you know, and also in terms of for example, like on camping trips, we have binary and separate facilities in general. And I would just like to proclaim as a parent that in any type of any type of school-based activity, any type of outing, I want all of our students to be protected from any kind of sexual aggression, because that's really what we're after when we're saying we want people to be safe and changing out and things like that, or sleeping. We want them safe. And knowing that even in binary quarters, it would be really heteronormative if we said sexual aggression would only be occurring from people of different
genders. Yeah.
So just wanted to throw that one out there and see if you had any thoughts or clarifications on this values clarification I'm wondering about.
Yeah, I don't often like, yeah, I've thought about this a lot, Ellen. I haven't been able to articulate it the wonderful way that you have, though, because oftentimes when I am trying to articulate it, it sounds like I'm saying like, hey, gay people can be aggressors too. And that's not always the greatest way to say it. But it really, it is something that, we are not really thinking of. In fact, a lot of my safety, like if you're saying that me in a room of people who identify as women I'm potentially unsafe, possibly one of those women are unsafe as well. It's not a situation that we can always account for, but we also want to separate queer people from being harassers, and like those are two separate ideas. And just like we have any policy around harassment, that also includes harassment in these new facilities that we're talking about. There is a way that we deal with that. So this is not letting people, I think there's also this idea of allowing people to be aggressors in that way, when no one is allowing that because we already have those policies in place. Let's not forget that.
Thank you, Joel.
Thank you, Ellen. Cool. Well, I appreciate all of you that hung in there. My info was in the chat. Feel free to reach out to me. And in-person meetups coming up with our young people. So we'd love to see all you there. Well, not you, but your children, but you too. If you need. And yeah, thanks again for inviting me.
Thank you, Joel. You're amazing.
Thank
we really
you.
appreciate you taking your time. I'll
Of
see you.
course. All right. See you all,
All right.
soon.
See you
Bye.
soon. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Shikin.
Thank you, Nadine. Thank you for saving the day.
Thank you so much.
All right, I'll see you around. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Jenny.